Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming in on a lovely evening out there. We'll spend just a few minutes indoors discussing how climate change will affect part of the biodiversity of the Gulf of Maine in years to come. We'll start with some general things to set the context in which we operate when we talk about non-native species. As this audience particularly knows, the oceans have changed rather dramatically over a great length of time due to human activity. Two commissions in the first decade of this century, a Pew Oceans Commission, a Federal Oceans Commission, came to the same conclusion that there were some drivers of ocean change, which are very familiar to certain audiences and perhaps not to others, and there's their interrelationship that is of special interest that I'll talk about later. For how long and where these occur, and their intensity varies, of course, around the world and in space and time. Fisheries operations, as you know, means not just over-extraction of fish and shellfish and other marine products, but how we fish, ghost fishing, trawling the seabed, all the ancillary things associated with fisheries. None of these things are new. There were issues of seafloor dredging had come to the attention of folks in England as early as the 1600s, and there's been discussion about over-extraction fisheries for hundreds of years. Of course, that has changed with various automations. Water quality, very important, and addressed variously also around the world. Point and non-point source pollution, point coming from things we can control, non-point much more difficult in terms of things that flow off very large watersheds. Removing the ocean, always effective. This would be the hardening of the coastal zone. This surprises a great many people who grow up in areas not thinking that this, where they lived and grown up and where their parents lived and grown up and their grandparents lived and grew up, was once ocean. So vast amounts of flat land along our shores were once, of course, marsh and open water. The hardening of the coastal zone has changed the amount of salt marsh in great many areas. Many large bays, iconic bays like San Francisco Bay or Puget Sound are considerably smaller than they were historically. We're going to talk about invasions of exotic species and global climate change. Of these, I would say that the first and the last evoke the most emotion, the most traction among what we call the 3 Ps. That's the public, the press, and the political world. In terms of general, visceral impact and understanding and what it might mean in terms of human endeavor and human economy. Fisheries, of course, because as we regulate fisheries, we risk putting people out of work. We risk modifying habits that have been in place for decades or centuries among the local fishery communities. This is well known around the world, not just North America. Global climate change, the same sort of thing, and often both accompanied by great passion on both sides, the antagonists and protagonists, the pros and cons. Another way to think about how we change what's out there is how we alter biodiversity. This is often divided up into what we call human versus non-human mediated change. In our general reading, it's often the dichotomy is human versus natural. This gets us into the issue of whether humans are natural. So we're going to avoid that and say humans versus non-human. There are 3 general ways in which we change what's out here, what's around this building, and what's in the Gulf of Maine, and wherever you grew up. We alter the abundance of species. We either depress them, which is very common. We increase the abundance of some species, which may not be the intention of what our activity. Genetic structure of populations altered. Whales in the ocean, a great example of that. Whale genetic diversity, not a surprise, far much smaller than it was historically, because, of course, the removal of large populations of whales. Extinction, the removing of species. So the first one is nothing is removed or added. We just alter the structure. The second is extinction. This is a scaled phenomenon. Habitat extinction would be, think of it in terms of a species that perhaps used to live in grasslands and forests and now just forest. Local extinction would be a species that used to be all over the Gulf of Maine and now just occurs in one place. Regional extinction would be a species that used to occur from Maine to Florida and now just in Chesapeake Bay. Global extinction, that's what we call the Wicked Witch model, not just dead, but very, very dead. And we think that there are a fair number of species that are out there that no longer exist. Functional extinction is very important. It means that the species no longer performs the role it did over evolutionary time. It used to be a major predator, a major competitor, a major consumer, and is now in such few numbers that it no longer has that regulatory aspect altering and cascading through the community. I'm going to guess you don't remember when you first heard of dodos being extinct. It's in your larval imprinting. How about marine extinctions? Except for my students who are here, you've never had a lecture about extinction in the sea. Why is that? Can you think of something that's gone extinct in the world's oceans? Anybody? Yes? Stellar sea cow, large, very large manatee relative that existed until the late 1700s up in the Aleutian Islands, an adult male, maybe half the width of this room and just as long. Massive animal. Famous marine mammal extinction taken out by the Russian hunters. Anything else? Are the seas immune to extinction? Would you say? After all the pressures for thousands of years, why don't we talk about extinction in the sea? It's a fascinating topic. We're here to talk about invasions and climate change. There are some other famous extinctions. There was a bird in the, great bird in the, it looked like a penguin, about 3 feet tall, called the great auk. It was very common through the North Atlantic until 1841, when the last two were found on a small island off of Iceland and were shot. There was the Korean cormorant. The Caribbean monk seal is gone. The Japanese sea lion is gone. Some charismatic larger marine mammals. A few birds. An extremely common bird here in the 1800s is the Labrador duck. So common it was in the Boston markets. That's extinct. It's a marine bird. Then we drop down to fish. Not so clear. No fish are believed to be extinct yet. Some on the edge, perhaps. And among invertebrates, mollusks and crustaceans, extremely poorly known. I'll just tell you that a working hypothesis is that we don't talk about it because it's rarely studied. It's not rare, it's rarely studied. And we can talk later about it if you're interested as to why that would be the case. Finally, we talk about invasions. So we can alter the abundance, we can remove species, and we can add species. All three of these are poorly known for any one place. We tend to study them as pieces rather than as a whole. Invasions are range expansions or introductions. That's where that dichotomy comes in, non-human versus human-mediated. Lots of synonyms: alien, invasive, non-indigenous, non-native, exotic, and so on. One often discussed question about invasions is aren't we just speeding up what happens anyway? Right? Because species were moving around before there were humans. So is this a rate function? Is extinction a rate function? We just speed up what happens anyway. I'm going to suggest that's not the case with invasions. That in fact, these two are very, very different. Range expansions are more or less predictable. It's called movement along corridors. Over long periods of time, species move up and down coastlines. They move across island chains. When the Arctic opens up, as it did 800,000 years ago, species from the North Pacific flow into the North Atlantic. When things change, we can usually predict that species will move along given paths. Those are range expansions. Sometimes those changes are due to humans, sometimes they're due to geological events. Introductions are quite different. Here we're talking about movement across barriers. Here we're talking about long distance movement. We can move any species anywhere in the world in 24 hours that has no precedent in Earth's history in any sense. Species do not naturally flow from Hong Kong to Rio de Janeiro, from Sydney to Puget Sound. We don't wake up here in the morning and think, cool African bird just landed, right? That's because there are huge barriers around the world. The oceans and the continents form such barriers that life evolved in very different ways around the world, which is why it's nice to be a tourist and go to exotic places and see exotic things. The winds and the ocean currents do not homogenize the world. In fact, they often act as the opposite, right? So these are very different sorts of things. It's not a rate function. We're not just speeding things up. Okay, a couple of more introductory thoughts. Two major epochs in our understanding of the history of life in the ocean in modern times. Before and after there are marine biologists. It's the great BMB and AMB periods. BMB is that the ocean is naturally assembled. The touch of the hand of man has not yet commenced before marine biologists appear. After marine biologists begin investigating the world, that's the baseline. That's when we have our first data, wherever it might be, let's say the 1850s. And after that, the world changes. Anybody know what this is called in environmental philosophy and environmental theory? You know what this phenomenon is called? This rotating our perception of nature around when the first data arrive, a general sense of that, called the shifting baseline syndrome. First introduced in fisheries, it applies broadly to our concept of environmental history. This says that with every 1 or 2 or 3 human generations, we reset to zero what we think is natural. If you've ever said this phrase, you should have seen it when I was a kid, that's the shifting baseline. My grandfather said the fish were this big. That's the shifting baseline. That means that within human memory, we identify what we think is a baseline. Historians know otherwise, right? Historians would say it goes much farther back. In first world countries that have the luxury to do restoration campaigns, conservation, preservation campaigns, not the case, of course, in many parts of the world, we have major, well-funded, often extremely expensive enterprises, such as Restore the Great Lakes, Restore Chesapeake Bay, Restore Puget Sound. Get on the websites of any of those. See if you can find a target date. You don't have a target date, how do you know when you restored something? If you pick a target date, like 1914, why did you pick that date? How about 1614? How about 1514? What's the target for restoration campaigns? Or is it the childhood of the people who formed those organizations? It's an important way in which we approach understanding environmental history. Why we ask about the past is a great question. What does it matter what this place looked like in 1914? All right? That's an important question in one or 1814 or 1714. Okay. The immediate effect of the shifting baseline for us is that species are either native or introduced. Native or endemic or indigenous, introduced has its definition about historical time, and it goes like this, that in classical ecology or environmental management, what we often say is if I don't know the history of a species, it's native. You might remember from a class in logic that you never want to begin a sentence with I don't know and come to a conclusion. Not the politicians from doing that. And yet the result of that is that in all of our guidebooks, local floras and faunas, all of Maine and everywhere else, species are either native or introduced. And that should strike you as something that would be hard to demonstrate. In fact, there are 3 categories. And there are a rather large and disappointing number of species that we simply do not know their history. They're called cryptogenic, and they fall into the native category by default. But there are 3 categories. If I have a lot of species that are cryptogenic, then I'm going to have a hard time understanding the history of my community and whether it changed in the times before marine biologists. People were moving around on the Earth's oceans since the 1500s commonly, right? Most of our marine biological data of much value starts in the 1900s. We have a 400-year gap, 400-year gap in our understanding of what might have been distributed by humans. 1500s is another one of those shifting baselines. The Vikings were very busy around 2,000 years ago. They had major trade routes in the Mediterranean, and they had cities established in North America. The Chinese Empire had fleets out on the east coast of Africa in the 1300s. It goes way back. Okay, with that, we do know that there are certain species well known that are introduced in the Gulf of Maine. Many of you know these, and we could go on for the rest of the evening with a slideshow about all the fascinating species that have arrived here over the past 200 years, which is about our baseline. We don't know about species that arrived here in the 1600s or 1700s, but our first window starts in the early 1800s. A very famous snail called Littorina littorea, which if you grew up along these shores, it is the common shore periwinkle, is a European species. It has one of the best records of spread of any non-native species in the ocean. We have almost a month-by-month history of when it spread from Canada down to Cape Cod and down to New Jersey. And who were collecting those data in that period of time? Not scientists, not fishermen, seashell collectors. It's an era when the public, through the 1800s, early 1900s, were generating huge amounts of natural history data, far more than they do now. The public was outdoors, studying plants, algae, seashells, rocks, collecting birds' eggs. That wasn't such a good idea. Everything you can imagine was being documented by the public as a hobby. Natural history was a huge public hobby. Back in the 1800s and up to the early 1900s, as I said, we owe a lot of our understanding to those early citizen scientists. This snail spreading down the coast altered virtually everything we can imagine about the rocky shore and salt marshes and mud flats. The rocks are bare where the populations are dense. It's hard to imagine the shores of New England prior to when we had these Carl Sagan-like numbers, billions and billions of these snails along the shore. An invasion of the 1940s was the European flat oyster. This puppy is about 3 to 4 inches in diameter. It has spread rather remarkably throughout New England. It seems to continue to spread over the past half century and more. This was an intentional introduction by a fisheries biologist in Boothbay Harbor, and it's done very well. Today we would not do that. Today we would not introduce this intentionally. There wouldn't be enough paper in the world to write the environmental impact statement, and then any number of laws that would prevent it anyway. In the 1960s, a 1-inch long little opossum shrimp, it's not a shrimp, but that's the name. This is a macroscopic thing. You can see this. It's called prawnus. It's a European species, and it continues to spread, which is interesting after some 50 years. Introduced by ballast water in the Gulf of Maine. In the 1970s, a number of species showed up. A rather famous little sea anemone called Diademina lineata, which has variable populations in the Gulf of Maine, all the way up to southern Canada. Famous sea squirt, a Sidian, a tunicate called Didymnum, has another name called Divex after its full Latin name, spreading through the Gulf of Maine in the 1970s, possibly starting in the Gulf of Maine in the 1970s, a Japanese species, now out on George's Bank, where it's a very unusual invasion. And because we don't associate invasions very often with the open ocean out there, mostly in the harbors and estuaries and bays, rocky shores and salt marshes. In retrospect, perhaps not so surprising, we often associate invasions with highly disturbed environments. And George's Bank would be a classic example of that in the ocean. Not a square millimeter has not been touched by some dredge and has been modified in many ways over the decades. There may be more invaders out there, but it's an environment rarely studied. This sea squirt forms these vast, gelatinous, messy lobes that really are very effective at covering everything. There's another sea squirt, also a Japanese species called Styla clava, which also appeared in the 1970s. You may know this if you own a boat and it covers the bottom of your boat. It's invaded the Gulf of Maine, the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the past decade and more, where it has had a rather direct impact on mussel farms. This is a mussel farm. The mussels would be under the sea squirts, and that's an issue. It's a species that can do very well as a fouling organism moving north into colder Canadian waters. A very recent invasion, one you may also know, is the Japanese shore crab. This arrived in the 1990s, continues to expand slowly. It's not very big. It comes to us by ballast water, first found in New Jersey, and now occurring from Acadia National Park all the way down to the Carolinas. This is a species that's south of Cape Cod and a little bit north of Cape Cod, is now often the only crab one finds. The sole crab on many shores. Not one of the most abundant, but the most abundant intertidal crab, where there used to be other species of crabs native and a previous introduced crab, the green crab, on many intertidal shores. It is a classic model of an invader that could not be predicted. It occurs in vast numbers. You wouldn't want to meet this thing in a dark alley at night. It eats everything they can. It's an omnivore. It has displaced and replaced not only other crabs, but a great many other species in the intertidal zone. Number of PhD theses, lots of master's theses, the very model of an invasion. I've testified 9 times before Congress and never once mentioned this species because it doesn't have traction. I can talk about its environmental, I can talk about how it has modified New England in amazing ways, but it fails in those 2 filters that we need to bring in the 3 Ps usually, and perhaps sadly, and that is what's the economic impact and what's the public health impact. So we don't use this species as a model because I can't work with many folks on the Hill in Washington, D.C. as to why this is important. That may have something to do with how our early education has worked historically. This crab, I'm going to skip over this real quick, is a species that occurs in the Rocky Intertidal Zone, RIZ, in Japan. It does not occur in the Rocky Subtidal Zone. It does not occur in salt marshes in Japan. This is called habitat expansion, one of the issues we have in predicting how a species will behave once it gets into a new environment. Mid-2000s, a very large, again, Western Pacific red algae began moving north of Cape Cod. It first showed up in Narragansett Bay. This is an impressive seaweed. It gets to 6 feet long. It's a good weed, as we like to say, very tolerant of wide salinities, wide temperatures, and moving into the Gulf of Maine in the mid-2000s. A species that most people would not notice is a rather calcareous little bryozoan called Tricelaria. It's a Japanese species. Might have come to us via Europe, first reported in 2012, first showing up in Eel Pond in Woods Hole and spreading north and south along the coast. So we have a history of invasions. I've shown you a few of the characters. We could go on about another 50 more easily. Our concern is that we know that species are moved. We know that Gulf of Maine can be invaded, is susceptible. And then our concern, therefore, is that we're entering and have been into a changing world, as you all know. Climate change is a very broad concept. We could spend from now until the morning talking about this, but it cascades into a very large number of physical and chemical modifications, which many people study, whether it's temperature, the pH of the ocean, salinity, sea level rise, UV, storm activity, many other things. Many of these are studied independently. But of course, it's hard to separate these out. We're going to look at temperature as one example of how climate change could impact invasions. I'm going to work you through a couple of fairly straightforward models. What's called scenario 1 is there'll be new places species come from, altering geographic sources. Scenario 2 is a little more complex and more interesting, which means we can how does warming temperatures alter what's called the invasion sequence? I want to walk you through both of these. Not surprisingly, we're talking about poleward expansion. Do you have any folks who wonder if the climate is changing and if it is expressed on the surface of the Earth, other than vast melting of ice and many other things? The world is expanding biologically. Species in the lower part of the northern hemisphere are going north, and the mirror image is happening in the southern hemisphere. Think of the whole world as expanding like this. Amazing stories from across all taxa and all species. Some of the best data that first came to our attention was butterflies. A number of species of butterflies in the deep south are gone, and other species are now in southern Canada, which historically had no butterflies of those species. Plankton is moving up in the oceans, trees moving, mammals moving. It's a very clear story in terms of poleward expansion and the mirror image. So we'll have species arriving from south of Cape Cod, coming up to Gulf of Maine. Overseas invasions then are another aspect of this, which is the species that have been coming into the Gulf of Maine from around the world for decades or centuries met a historically colder environment. The Gulf of Maine is now more susceptible to warmer water species. Species expansions from the south, larval dispersal, rafting, not preventable. They're coming. Overseas invasions, if they come by ships, which is about the only way that can happen, potentially preventable. That's in the ballast water model and other vectors that can bring species from Europe to here. Species cannot get here naturally from Europe to the Gulf of Maine. For one reason, the Gulf Stream is generally going the other direction. Around the world, this has various names. Caribbean creep refers to a rather remarkable phenomenon now happening in the Carolinas and Georgia. Some of the most abundant species are Caribbean species. Historically, of course, the Carolinas would be too cold for Caribbean species, but one of the most common crabs down there, like our Asian short crab, is a Caribbean species. African advance is the movement of African species into Europe. This is also called the tropicalization of the Mediterranean, which is happening at a rather rapid rate. Of course, species that are south of us, Long Island Sound, Chesapeake Bay, might be native species or previously introduced species, right? They're south of us, headed north. We consider those invasions. A native species moving from Long Island Sound to the Gulf of Maine is an invasion. In the same sense that a species from overseas would be an invasion, because it's a novel member of the community and could be of some concern economically, ecologically, and so on. So we're going to consider these as part of the invasion model. Here's a practical example. What's moving north and south? Our interest is what's moving north along the Atlantic coast. Wood-boring species, shipworms, which are clams, ribbles, which are little crustaceans. We have a number of species that are well known. They're warmer water. They're restricted to warmer waters. Can't get into colder northern waters. Poleward. These are going to be moving north. In some cases, we already have those records around the world. If you happen to have a harbor full of wooden pilings, that would be of interest to you as a prediction. So we can confidently predict this. This should be surprise reduction to managers and important harbor managers that, in fact, before the docks start to fall down in the years or decades to come, we actually know this is going to be happening, and there's plenty of time to do something about that. That's one of many kinds of examples of how knowing about this can inform coastal management. This gets a little more complicated. I'm going to walk you through this, but this is really fascinating. This is called altering the sequence of invasions. Let's say I've got a species from Europe. It could come over here and invade the Gulf of Maine. Let's say I have a species from Chile, or some comparable, cool, warm, temperate environment that's going to be coming up into the Gulf of Maine. What we call classic invasion models have 4 steps. It's very simple. You're introduced, you colonize, you establish, you spread. That's a standard model. Same thing is shown in a textbook. You're transported You're introduced, you establish, and you spread. These are these 4 things that we often teach in invasion biology. Were the world that simple, that would be lovely. In fact, the steps are much more complicated. In order to understand what happens in an invasion sequence, we talk about where species come from, about who's in train, how they're transported, what happens on arrival, survival, reproduction, establishment. Introduction doesn't happen until stage 7. It's not that simple little 4-step model. We need this kind of model to understand the consequences of climate change. It permits us to measure things on the right-hand side. I can ask about the probability of getting on the boat. That's number 1. I can ask about the probability of surviving the trip. That's part 3. I can ask about the probability of getting off the boat. That's 4. What's the probability of surviving once you get off the boat? What if you're a marine species and you just arrived in Duluth, in Lake Superior, and all the salt water is being released into the Great Lakes? You've made it, but you're not going to make it past step 4 and 5 because you're marine, and suddenly you find yourself in fresh water and you die. There are these so-called survival windows. There's 4 steps where things can wink out pretty quickly. Now we apply the concept of how would a warming world alter the sequence of events. Right up at the top, I'm going to be changing the regional pool species diversity of what's the donor ports. The donor ports are changing. Ships coming from the same place for 100 years are coming with different species. We've relied for a long time, the shipping industry and others have relied for a long time that everything that would be here by now. Every European species, port or harbor, has been coming over on boats for 500 years. It's all here. We know that's not the case, partly because things are changing in Europe as well. The climate can alter the abundance of species, which alters the chance of getting on the boat. Walking it down, the routes over which ships travel are going to be different temperatures, could increase what's called in-transit survival. Where I'm arriving, as we just said, Gulf of Maine, milder, warmer. It's a new world. Species that failed to survive earlier. Again, chance of reproduction, warmer waters, growth rate is shorter, shortened time to reproduction, possibly more food, range expansion also enhanced by climate change. So we can go back, let's get through the system, to look at almost every step can be altered, and really it's a story of changes in the donor region, changes in the recipient region, is why invasions might continue and change in a different world. Okay. So I know that, I can predict that. The question is, how do we know what's out there? How do I know these species are arriving? I'm going to talk about 3 parts of that. One we just talked about, shifting baselines. Don't have a good picture of the past. Something called the Smalls rule, and what we'll just call finger on the pulse. That's what we just talked about a few minutes ago. The shifting baseline says we have a very vague memory of what the Gulf of Maine looked like at the turn of the last century. Unless we have historical data, which we do not on many marine species, it's sort of an oral history. The Smalls rule is pretty simple. If you're small, you're native. How do you feel about that? Why could that possibly be the thought among many professional scientists? It's part of the scale of resolution of how we understand the history of species and their taxonomy. We have an example from San Francisco Bay. I don't have the numbers for the Gulf of Maine, but this applies to the Gulf of Maine in exactly the same way. In San Francisco Bay, there might be about 1,000 species, roughly. Number of invertebrates, fish, and algae, and that's pretty much a guess. It turns out we don't actually know. We don't know how many species are in Chesapeake Bay. We don't know how many species are in the Gulf of Maine. We don't know how many species are on Long Island Sound. We don't know the numbers of species today in every iconic body of water in North America. There's simply no list. It's a remarkable thing. And you'd think with the interest in biodiversity, we'd have that. Of course, it's a challenge to make those lists. It's a huge challenge. But let's say about 1,000 because that's a working number. And there are about 500 species of diatoms, phytoplankton, small, often photosynthetic organisms of a wide range of diversity. The number of species of invertebrates, fish, and algae in San Francisco Bay that are recognized as non-native is about 300. How many species of diatoms do you think are recognized? And I'll preface that by saying that we know that ballast water from all over the world, rich with thousands of species of diatoms, has been dumped in San Francisco Bay since over 100 years, and these have come with many other vectors as well. Any relative numbers? Guesses? If you say how many non-native diatoms have the phytoplankton people resolved? And that's a pretty good number. That's better than the invertebrates because there's a whole bunch of people studying phytoplankton in San Francisco Bay. 0. I'm going to guess there's a bias there. But it alters my perception, doesn't it, about how San Francisco Bay works. It alters my perception of how San Francisco Bay has changed, and whether or not some of the key species that are at the bottom of the trophic system only came in relatively recently and have altered what I think is how trophic dynamics work. We talk about present-day invasions and then wrap things up. This is called finger on the pulse. I'll give you an example that comes to us from shrimp. These shrimp are between 1 and 3 inches long. I'm not talking about really small things. We have 3 species of native shrimp called Palomonides. I'm going to use the old genus name. It just changed, but it's so convenient. We're going to call them Palomonides. These are the grass shrimp you may have grown up with. They're very, very common south of Cape Cod. They're less common north of Cape Cod, but they are present. It's just a ubiquitous coastal species. In 2001, a fairly large Japanese shrimp called Palomon macrodactylus was discovered in the Bronx River in New York City. This puppy's 3 inches long. It's a big thing, native to the Western Pacific Ocean. However, it wasn't mentioned until 2010. It was discovered by ichthyologists who didn't publish it for about a decade. Upon publication, we realized that, in fact, that species was widespread all through Long Island Sound and had simply been mistaken as the native shrimp, even though it looked different, the color was different, and the size was different. Nobody noticed, except for these two folks working on fish down in New York, that this shrimp had spread through Long Island Sound. In 2010, we did what's called a rapid assessment survey for invasives. We do that every now and again. And we went searching north of Cape Cod for this Asian shrimp, asking had it spread farther than Long Island Sound, had it spread to the north and south. We got up to Salem, and we found a thriving population of an equally large shrimp with remarkable colors called Palomon elegans, and was doing extremely well north of Boston. And nobody had noticed. It's very unlikely that these are the only large-bodied species that have been unnoticed along the New England coast. And these stories come to us from around the world, that fairly large and obvious things have gone unnoticed right under our eyes for some length of time. We can talk about why that might be, but your chances of meeting a marine biologist on the shore are nearly zero, right? You go to the beach, you'll never meet a marine biologist. There are few marine biologists compared to the number of citizens who are out on the coast. So we rely on citizens to tell us, by and large, the pulse of things, the finger on the pulse. We have thousands and tens of thousands of people who are watching the coast, but not many marine biologists in this case. So that gets us to some predictions. Here are some species that are coming north This little isopod is 1 inch long. It's not a small little microscopic thing, and they occur by the tens of thousands. There's another sea squirt over here that's about the size of a walnut, very distinctive. This large bryozoan called Zobotryon is called spaghetti weed. It's mistaken as a seaweed. It forms masses 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Very distinctive. I'd like to tell you that we know they're not here, but given the shrimp story, not always reliable. There are species from the east, and by that we mean Europe. There's a long list of species we're expecting. There's another Asian shore crab, which looks somewhat like the crab that's already here, a famous seaweed called Sargassum unicum. There are sea squirts. It's a famous barnacle. These are species that we think there's no reason why they can't invade and become common in a place like the Gulf of Maine. What about the rest of the world? What's that list look like? That's a real challenge, because we never would have predicted an Asian shore crab to show up on the New England coast. Okay, real quick, just as a wrap up, those are the drivers of change that we talked about at the very beginning. They are an interrelated matrix. Climate change impacts introductions. Fisheries impacts introductions. Water quality impacts fisheries and introductions. Habitat alteration impacts everything. The challenge is that these are largely studied, as I said before, in individual bins. And why is that? Because it requires a lifetime of expertise to become expert in one of those, let alone the whole relationship between that web. In the meantime, the world is changing in the sense of vectors. Ships move about 90% of all world goods. Maritime trade controls the world's economy. I'm guessing that most people also aren't aware of that. As ships move, so does the world's economy. Petroleum exploration is going to increase steadily. Live seafood, aquaculture, and so on. There's an itchiness here of vectors, which we try to look at from a management point of view more and more, colliding with constant kaleidoscopic world. Our goal in policy and management is try to understand all of this, try to regulate these vectors so that they do not continue to interact with a world that's increasingly hard to predict, especially along a coastal zone. I tend to be optimistic about this, which might seem kind of odd, but we of course are now in a world where there is more attention to all of this than ever before. Right? We are living in an era when interest and concern about conservation, about the future, has never been greater. That gives me some hope that we have a lot of thinking and a lot of effort going into this, which I would not have said a few decades ago at all. A few decades ago, there were no jobs for faculty at universities called conservation biology. Unheard of in academia. Now, there are conservation biology jobs at universities. So I think the trend in terms of traction is a very positive one. It can seem overwhelming, but I think we've tackled a lot of these things and continue to tackle these things in the way of increasing knowledge. It's about surprise reduction, it's about frustration reduction, it's about being able to predict as best we can what the outcome of some of these scenarios might be. Okay, thanks very much.